The heavy envelope containing his termination letter felt like lead in his pocket. The automatic glass doors of the massive city hospital slid shut behind him for the very last time. His white coat was neatly folded in his bag. Walking home under the fading afternoon sun, a horrific, violent screech of tearing metal echoed across the busy intersection. An SUV had violently flipped on its side. Panicked bystanders gathered, pulling out their phones. Nobody knew what to do. The man paused. He looked at the smoking wreckage. He didn't have a hospital badge anymore. He didn't have a contract, but he was still a doctor, and he ran straight toward the fire. His name was Dr. Nathan Reed, 45 years old with deep, exhausted lines etched around his eyes from 17 grueling years of working the chaotic, bloody trenches of the city's busiest Level 1 trauma center. His hands were incredibly steady, scarred by thousands of frantic sutures and chest tubes, and his mind was a heavily fortified steel vault built to withstand the absolute worst days of other people's lives. He was a single father, his entire universe. The only thing that kept him tethered to the ground when the brutal reality of the emergency room threatened to pull him under was his 9-year-old daughter, Maya. Maya was a fiercely intelligent, deeply empathetic little girl who loved painting and possessed a profound understanding of her father's unpredictable life. She knew that when his pager beeped in the middle of dinner, it meant someone was hurt. She knew the smell of hospital antiseptic that lingered on his skin. She was his anchor. But as of 2 p.m. this afternoon, Nathan's life had been completely, violently upended. He hadn't made a catastrophic medical error. He hadn't lost his license, and he hadn't compromised patient care. In fact, his clinical record was absolutely, statistically flawless. Nathan had been fired because of a spreadsheet. The massive hospital network had recently been acquired by a ruthless, aggressively profit-driven private equity firm. The new board of directors, men and women who wore expensive suits and had never once felt the frantic, fading pulse of a dying patient, mandated immediate, brutal cost-cutting measures. They looked at the payroll. They saw Nathan's senior salary, earned through nearly 2 decades of absolute loyalty and unmatched frontline trauma experience, and they simply saw a negative red number on a financial ledger. They decided they could replace him with 3 fresh, inexperienced, heavily overworked junior residents for the exact same cost. Nathan hadn't argued. He didn't scream at the human resources director. He didn't throw a dramatic tantrum or threaten to sue. He simply accepted the heavy manila envelope, nodded politely to the terrified HR representative, cleaned out his narrow metal locker, and folded up his pristine, white attending physician's coat. He left quietly, a silent exit for a man who had saved thousands of screaming lives within those very walls. Now he was walking home. His old sedan was in the shop, so he took the long, 2-mile route down the busy, fading metropolitan avenues. The late afternoon sun cast long, melancholic shadows across the pavement. The heavy termination letter burned in his jacket pocket. He was mentally practicing the agonizing conversation he would have to have with Maya that evening. He would have to explain why they couldn't afford her expensive summer art camp anymore. He would have to explain why he suddenly had so much free time. He felt an incredibly deep, suffocating wave of pure failure wash over him. Without his white coat, without the ER, he suddenly felt entirely invisible. He felt useless. He reached the crowded intersection of 5th and Elm. The traffic was dense, the air thick with the smell of exhaust and the chaotic noise of rush hour commuters. And then, the ordinary afternoon violently shattered. It started with the sickening, high-pitched squeal of locking brakes. A heavy commercial delivery truck had brutally blown through a solid red light. Crash. The impact was absolutely deafening. The massive steel grille of the truck T-boned a dark gray family SUV with horrifying explosive velocity. The sheer kinetic energy lifted the 2-ton SUV completely off the ground. It rolled violently, metal screaming against asphalt, shattering glass raining down like diamonds, before finally slamming to a violent halt on its passenger side. A thin, dark plume of smoke immediately began to hiss from the crushed radiator. The intersection descended into instant, screaming anarchy. Pedestrians shrieked and scattered. Cars slammed on their horns. People immediately froze, pulling out their smartphones to record the disaster, paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying reality of physical trauma. Nathan Reed stopped walking. He looked at the crushed, smoking metal. He looked at the heavy envelope in his pocket. He was technically unemployed. He had zero legal obligation to step onto that dangerous street. He had no medical equipment, no trauma team, and no hospital backing him up. But the oath he took 17 years ago wasn't a corporate contract. It was a vow. Nathan dropped his heavy bag on the sidewalk. The tired, defeated, unemployed father instantly vanished. The trauma surgeon woke up. Nathan sprinted into the chaotic, dangerous intersection, completely ignoring the blaring car horns and the gathering, panicked crowd. His eyes moved with terrifying, robotic precision, instantly executing the primary triage algorithm he had drilled into his brain thousands of times. Scene safety, environmental hazards, triage priority. He smelled the air, coolant and burnt rubber, but no raw gasoline. The immediate risk of a catastrophic explosion was low, but the vehicle was profoundly unstable. He reached the overturned SUV. The windshield was entirely obliterated, leaving a jagged, gaping hole into the crushed cabin. "Get back! Everyone, get back right now!" Nathan roared. His voice was no longer the soft, tired tone of a struggling father. It was the absolute deafening boom of an ER attendant commanding a trauma bay. The sheer, undeniable authority in his voice made the gawking bystanders instantly step back. Nathan climbed up onto the shattered front hood, looking down into the sideways cabin. The driver, a man in his early 40s, was suspended awkwardly in his seatbelt. The airbags had deployed, filling the cabin with a fine, chalky white dust. The man's head was slumped forward at a terrifying, unnatural angle against his chest. Blood was flowing freely from a deep, jagged laceration on his forehead. But that wasn't what terrified Nathan. What terrified Nathan was the absolute silence. The man wasn't screaming. Nathan leaned his upper body through the shattered windshield, carefully avoiding the razor-sharp glass. He pressed 2 fingers deeply into the side of the man's neck, feeling for the carotid artery. Thump, thump, thump. The pulse was there. It was rapid, thready, and incredibly weak, indicating massive internal shock. But the heart was still fighting. However, as Nathan watched the man's chest, he realized something horrifying. The chest wasn't rising. The unnatural, slumped angle of the driver's neck was entirely cutting off his windpipe. He was suffocating on his own anatomy. "I need someone to call 911 right now," Nathan yelled over his shoulder to the paralyzed crowd. A young man in a business suit held up his phone, his hands shaking violently. "I'm on the line. They're asking what's happening." "Put it on speaker and hold it near me," Nathan commanded. The young man scrambled forward, holding the glowing phone out. "Dispatch, listen to me very carefully." Nathan spoke directly toward the phone, his voice absolutely devoid of panic, vibrating with icy clinical precision. "My name is Dr. Nathan Reed. I am a licensed emergency trauma physician on scene at 5th and Elm. We have a high-velocity, 2-vehicle lateral impact. I have 1 priority red male patient, mid-40s, unconscious, trapped in an overturned vehicle with a severely compromised airway and suspected critical cervical spine trauma. I need heavy rescue for extrication and an advanced life support bus immediately." The dispatcher on the other end, accustomed to hearing hysterical, screaming witnesses, immediately recognized the cold, structured language of a veteran medical professional. "Copy that, Dr. Reed. Heavy rescue and ALS are rolling. ETA is 8 minutes. Are you able to secure the airway?" "I am executing a jaw thrust maneuver now," Nathan replied. In trauma medicine, you never violently pull a crash victim out of a car unless it is literally on fire. Yanking a patient with a fractured neck can instantly sever their spinal cord, paralyzing or killing them in a microsecond. Nathan had to open the man's airway without moving his spine a single millimeter. He leaned deeper into the crushed, suffocatingly hot cabin. He placed his calloused hands carefully on the angles of the man's jaw. With extreme, calculated, agonizingly precise pressure, Nathan pushed the jawbone forward and up, lifting the tongue away from the back of the throat while keeping the neck perfectly, rigidly immobilized. It was a maneuver that required absolute perfection. Suddenly, the driver let out a harsh, wet, rattling gasp. His chest heaved violently as oxygen finally rushed past the blockage and flooded into his starving lungs. "I have the airway open," Nathan reported calmly, his muscles burning from the awkward angle, maintaining the rigid pressure on the jaw. He is breathing spontaneously but shallow. GCS is a 3. He is completely unresponsive. "Doctor," the dispatcher's voice crackled through the phone speaker, sounding incredibly tense. "City General Hospital is currently on a total diversion protocol due to a massive power grid failure in their sector. They are not accepting level 1 traumas. The nearest capable trauma center is St. Jude's, but rush hour traffic has the interstate completely deadlocked. An ambulance will take 45 minutes to get him there." Nathan's eyes narrowed. 45 minutes for a patient with a massive head injury and likely internal bleeding was an absolute death sentence. The golden hour of trauma survival was rapidly evaporating. Nathan didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for permission. He gave an order. "Dispatch, 45 minutes is unacceptable. He will bleed out in the bus. Upgrade this call right now. I am requesting an immediate medevac helicopter intercept. Have them set down in the municipal park 2 blocks from this intersection. Tell them to bring intubation gear and whole blood. Move." "Copy that, doctor. Scrambling LifeFlight now." Nathan remained frozen in position, his arms aching, holding the dying stranger's airway open, whispering calm, steady reassurances to a man who couldn't even hear him. He didn't have his white coat. He didn't have a badge. He just had his hands, his knowledge, and his absolute refusal to let someone die on his watch. If you firmly believe that a true professional's duty doesn't end just because a corporation terminates their contract, hit that subscribe button to witness the incredible moment the sky begins to roar. 8 agonizing minutes later, the wail of approaching sirens finally cut through the city noise. 2 heavy fire rescue trucks and an ambulance violently hopped the curb, surrounding the crushed SUV. Firefighters in heavy turnout gear immediately leaped from the rigs, carrying massive hydraulic spreaders. The jaws of life. The lead paramedic sprinted over to the wrecked vehicle. He looked inside and saw Nathan, sweating, his arms shaking slightly from muscle fatigue, still perfectly maintaining the cervical spine immobilization. "I've got the C-collar, Doc," the paramedic said, sliding the rigid plastic brace carefully around the driver's neck while Nathan maintained the jaw thrust. "Good hold. You saved his brain from starving." "He's got a blown left pupil and clear fluid leaking from his right ear," Nathan reported, executing a flawless, rapid-fire clinical handover as he finally stepped back from the wreck. "Suspected severe basilar skull fracture and increasing intracranial pressure. Heart rate is bounding at 130. Blood pressure is tanking. He is bleeding internally, likely a ruptured spleen or hepatic lase. He needs to be intubated immediately before the flight." The firefighters engaged the hydraulic spreaders. The terrifying, ear-piercing sound of tearing metal shrieked through the air as they ruthlessly ripped the roof off the SUV to safely extricate the dying man onto a rigid backboard. As they pulled the patient out, a new, massive, incredibly powerful sound began to build in the distance. Whoomp, whoomp, whoomp. The deep, rhythmic, chest-thumping vibration of a heavy helicopter rotor began to shake the glass windows of the surrounding office buildings. The crowd looked up in absolute awe. A massive, sleek, bright red and white LifeFlight medevac helicopter descended violently from the sky, its powerful downdraft whipping up a massive storm of dust, leaves, and trash as it executed a perfect, high-skill landing right in the middle of the large municipal park just 100 yards away. The side doors slid open before the skids even touched the grass. 2 heavily geared flight medics sprinted out, carrying massive trauma bags, running directly toward the accident scene. They reached the ambulance where the ground paramedics were desperately trying to stabilize the patient. "What do we have?" the lead flight medic shouted over the deafening noise of the idling helicopter rotors. "Dispatch said we had an ER doc on scene who called the bird. Who's the doctor?" The crowd of bystanders who had been watching in stunned silence all simultaneously pointed toward the man in the faded jacket standing quietly near the ambulance. The flight medic turned. He looked at Nathan. He didn't see a man in a pristine white coat. He didn't see a stethoscope around his neck or a shiny ID badge. He just saw a guy in jeans with blood on his hands. But as the flight medic jogged closer, his eyes widened in sudden, profound recognition. "Dr. Reed!" the flight medic yelled over the rotors, utterly shocked. The medic had flown dozens of critical patients into City General's trauma bay over the last 5 years. He knew Nathan perfectly. He knew Nathan was the absolute calmest, most brilliantly skilled surgeon in the entire hospital network. If Nathan was in the trauma bay, the patient had a fighting chance. "It's me, Jackson," Nathan shouted back, recognizing the medic. "What the hell are you doing out here without your gear, Doc?" the medic asked, instantly deferring to Nathan's superior medical authority. "Why aren't you in scrubs?" Nathan looked down at his blood-stained hands, then back at the medic. His face was a mask of stoic, unbothered calm. "Not anymore, Jackson," Nathan replied simply. "I don't work there anymore. Let's focus on the patient." Nathan didn't waste a single second complaining about his unfair termination. He didn't tell a sob story. He immediately launched into the high-level trauma debriefing. "Listen to me," Nathan ordered, his voice cutting through the noise of the helicopter. "His airway is swelling fast from the facial trauma. Do not attempt a standard direct laryngoscopy in the air. You won't be able to see the cords through the blood. Use the video glide scope and be prepared for an emergency surgical cricothyrotomy if you can't pass the tube. Push 1 gram of tranexamic acid immediately to slow the internal hemorrhaging and keep his head elevated at 30 degrees to manage the cranial pressure. Do you copy?" The flight medic didn't argue. He didn't question the diagnosis. He absorbed the incredibly dense, high-level surgical advice like a sponge. "Copy all, Doc. Video scope, TXA. Elevate the head," the medic confirmed, strapping the patient onto the specialized flight stretcher. "We owe you one. This guy would have been dead in 10 minutes without that jaw thrust." "Just get him to St. Jude's," Nathan said, taking a step back. The flight medics rushed the patient toward the waiting helicopter. The massive rotors spooled up to maximum speed, the deafening roar drowning out the city, and the bird violently lifted off the grass, banking sharply toward the trauma center, carrying a man who was only alive because of the unemployed guy standing on the sidewalk. Nathan watched the helicopter disappear into the clouds. He let out a long, heavy, shuddering exhale. The adrenaline was finally leaving his system, leaving his arms aching and his knees weak. He walked back to the sidewalk, picked up his heavy bag containing his useless white coat, and quietly resumed his walk home to his daughter. He left no business card. He didn't speak to the local news cameras that were just arriving. He simply vanished back into the city. 2 hours later, the chaotic hum of the emergency department at St. Jude's Medical Center was in full swing. The severely injured driver from the SUV crash had been successfully stabilized in the operating room. The chief of trauma surgery at St. Jude's walked out of the OR, stripping off his bloody gloves, deeply impressed by the outcome. He walked over to Jackson, the flight medic who was finishing his flight paperwork at the nurse's station. "Incredible job on the field airway, Jackson," the chief surgeon praised. "If that patient had been hypoxic for even 3 more minutes on the street, his brain would have turned to mush. The jaw thrust saved him." Jackson shook his head, looking up from his tablet. "Don't thank me, Doc. We didn't do the initial stabilization. It was Dr. Nathan Reed from City General. He just happened to be walking by the intersection when the truck hit. He held the guy's airway open with his bare hands until the fire department cut him out. He called the bird." The chief surgeon frowned, utterly confused. "Nathan Reed? What was he doing walking down the street at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday? He's the lead attending over at City General. He basically lives in their trauma bay." Jackson looked around, lowering his voice. "He told me he doesn't work there anymore, Doc. Didn't have a badge or anything." The medical community in a major city is incredibly small and fiercely tight-knit. The gossip spread like wildfire. Within an hour, the chief surgeon at St. Jude's had made a phone call to the medical director at City General, asking why the hell they had let their most experienced trauma surgeon go. Back at City General, the atmosphere in the executive boardroom was turning incredibly sour. The chief medical director, Dr. Eris Thorne, a man who actually cared about medicine but was constantly overruled by the corporate board, had just found out about Nathan's termination from the HR department. He was absolutely furious. He slammed his hands on the polished mahogany table, glaring at the private equity executives who had made the cost-cutting decision. You fired Nathan Reed? Dr. Thorne yelled, abandoning all professional courtesy. Are you people completely out of your minds? Do you just look at a spreadsheet and cross off the highest numbers without looking at what they actually do? It was a necessary optimization of payroll, a young, arrogant financial analyst defended nervously. We replaced his salary with 3 junior residents. It increases our floor coverage by 200%. 3 junior residents do not equal 1 Nathan Reed, Dr. Thorne roared, his face flushed red. A resident knows how to read a textbook. Nathan Reed knows how to keep a human soul inside a bleeding body. I just got a call from St. Jude's. Nathan saved a man's life on the street today with his bare hands. He commanded a chaotic scene, diagnosed a bestseller skull fracture without a CT scanner, and coordinated a medevac flawlessly. Your junior residents would have stood there and watched the man suffocate while trying to look up the protocol on their iPhones. The boardroom went dead silent. The executives looked at each other, the horrifying reality of their blind, greedy mistake slowly sinking in. They hadn't just fired an employee, they had amputated the absolute best part of their hospital's capability. You don't cut costs by firing the general who wins the wars, Dr. Thorne said coldly, picking up his phone. I am fixing this, and if you try to stop me, I will resign and take the entire senior surgical staff with me. The sun had finally set. Nathan sat in his small, modest kitchen, watching Maya enthusiastically paint a watercolor picture at the table. He had just finished cooking macaroni and cheese. He was exhausted, his muscles aching from the violent physical exertion of the rescue. He hadn't told Maya about being fired yet. He couldn't find the right words. Suddenly, his cell phone buzzed on the counter. The caller ID read, Dr. Eris Thorne, Medical Director. Nathan frowned. He answered it slowly. Hello, Eris. If you're calling to apologize for HR, you don't have to. I'm not calling to apologize, Nathan. Eris's voice crackled through the speaker, sounding entirely exhausted, but intensely determined. I'm calling to hire you back. The corporate board overstepped. They didn't consult me. I just threatened to walk out if they didn't reverse the termination immediately. Nathan stayed quiet. He looked over at Maya, who was smiling at her painting. Eris, Nathan said softly, I'm tired. I'm tired of the 80-hour weeks. I'm tired of the bureaucracy telling me how to practice medicine. Today, walking home. It was the first time in years I actually felt like a real doctor again, instead of just a billing machine for a corporation. I know, Eris said gently, which is why I'm not offering you your old contract. I'm offering you the Director of Emergency Education. It's a strictly part-time, highly specialized clinical role. You work 3 days a week. You only handle the most critical level 1 traumas, and you spend the rest of your time teaching those idiot junior residents how to actually save lives instead of just reading charts. You set your own hours. You go home to your daughter every night. You name your price. Nathan looked at the phone. He looked at Maya. He realized he didn't have to choose between being a father and being a doctor. He could demand the balance he deserved because they have finally realized exactly what he was worth. I'll be in your office at 9 a.m. to review the paperwork, Nathan said, a small, genuine smile finally touching his lips. He hung up the phone. Maya looked up from her painting. She noticed the small, dried flecks of blood on her father's shoes that he hadn't fully managed to wash off. She tilted her head, her young eyes full of innocent curiosity. Dad, Maya asked softly, I thought you didn't have to work today. Were you still a doctor today? Nathan walked over, wrapping his strong arms around his daughter, kissing the top of her head. He thought about the crushed SUV. He thought about the thumping rotors of the helicopter descending from the sky, answering his call. He realized that a piece of paper from HR could take away his parking space, but it could never, ever take away who he fundamentally was. Always, Maya, Nathan whispered, holding her tight. Always. The helicopter hadn't landed in that park because Nathan had a fancy contract, or a high salary, or a pristine white coat. It landed because when the world violently shattered and a life was slipping into the dark, a doctor doesn't need an employer's permission to do exactly what he was born to do. If you firmly believe that your true, undeniable value does not depend on your job title, your corporate contract, or what a spreadsheet says you are worth. Hit that subscribe button to follow more powerful stories of quiet heroes winning in the end. Tell us in the comments down below, have you ever been let go or severely underestimated by a company only to immediately prove to the world that your skills were far more valuable than they ever realized? Would you still step up to help someone if you were off the clock?